All right, welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to continue to work with our taco spinner. We're going to make one small addition to our switch class that we created in the previous lesson. This is something that I want to use as a pattern for all of our web interactions going forward, and it's something I think you're going to find useful as well when you're developing your own interactions in your applications. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to add an option to our configuration for our switch class that will allow us to kind of hook on to the event that occurs whenever you are actually switching or toggling the class on and off. And you'll find this is really, really useful, especially if you are developing interactions that are going to be used as kind of like a component library or something that you're going to hand off to other developers for them to use. There may be instances where, for whatever reason, whenever someone goes to use your web interaction, you need to turn around, or that developer needs to turn around and say, okay, your interaction allows me to toggle the class on and off. But also, every time we toggle, I want to run this custom code. And you can kind of call this like an event hook or a custom event firing that occurs in the life cycle of your web interaction that you're actually creating. And it's actually fairly easy to add. So we're going to add that to our switch, and then I'm going to show you an example of how that can actually be implemented in an instance of one of our switch buttons that we've created. So first of all, let's jump over into Visual Studio Code. We have our switch class open here, which you can see has only one configuration option at the moment, which is the name of the attribute, the data attribute that we're using to actually enable this switch functionality on target HTML elements. And what we're going to do in order to create, let's just call this a lifecycle event. What we're going to do in order to create a lifecycle event is we are going to come down and add a new option to our object that we're setting to the configuration for this component. And we're going to call this onSwitch. And this is not going to be a string value or a number value or like a Boolean, a primitive JavaScript value. I actually want this to be a function. So this is, again, it's like an event that occurs that you want people to be able to hook onto and say, when you toggle, I want to do this, or when you switch, I want to do this. And so basically what we can do is we can add, just as a default value, an empty arrow function, so that by default onSwitch doesn't do anything. But now the user using this object.assign, or the developer rather, can override the value of this onSwitch property of the configuration for this component. And they can say, actually, when you run onSwitch, I want to be able to do something custom in my component that I'm configuring. So that's pretty cool. Let's see what that looks like. First of all, we're going to need to implement this into our switch method that we have on this class, because right now, even though we've defined this as a configuration option property, it's not actually being used anywhere. So that's the first thing we need to do. We'll scroll down here to where we have our switch method itself. And then after we switch that button, the very last line of this method, we will fire the onSwitch event. And this is pretty easy to fire off that configuration event. We basically are just going to say this.config.onSwitch. So that's going to get a reference to that event that was defined in our configuration. And we just call it like so, just using parentheses, just like that. And if we save and we go and test our application, you'll notice it does absolutely nothing. I can clear the console, nothing different than what it did before, because again, our default value for the onSwitch, config.onSwitch, is an empty function. That's the default value up here, so it doesn't do anything by default, but we are calling it every time we switch on a particular switch button. And that means whenever we instantiate this, so for example, on our jiggle button, our burrito button, we can say, actually on switch, I want to do something. I want to console.log switching, just as one example. So I can kind of override that and run some custom code in my instance of the switch. And that way, when you click on a toggle button, it still doesn't do anything, because this instance of the switch doesn't have a custom onSwitch method. But whenever we click on the burrito button, you'll see it logs switching down here. And it's going to call that every time that switch method actually occurs. And the reason why I call this a lifecycle method is it's kind of like over the life cycle of the component, there are certain events that it could occur as a normal part of that component's life. It is initialized, and then it's switched on and off, and then maybe you have a destroy event, and you can create as many of these as you want. But it's going to make your components that you're building so much more flexible because it really unlocks some very complex functionality that users could utilize, especially if you provide some data along with these lifecycle events that you're creating. And just as an example, maybe perhaps in sort of the signature for this, we want to say, okay, not only do I want to have an empty event be default, but I also want to kind of specify that we want some parameters along with this on-switch event. So maybe I want to be passed an argument that's going to tell me what the button is that I actually clicked on, what's the switch button. And then also, is it switched? Is it active at the time that this lifecycle event is actually called? And now that we've changed this in our in the place where we actually fire off this event in our switch method, so if we scroll down here, all I have to do is pass in the button, which we already have a reference to that up here. And then in order to get is switched, I can basically, you'll notice up here, we're doing a classlist.toggle, button.classlist.toggle. There's a handy method on there that's button.classlist.contains. And then I'll actually want to see if it contains this attribute value. So I think I'm actually going to move that to its own variable. So get switch class, I guess, const switch class equals, and then we'll get the value of that attribute. And then we can use this in both of those places rather than having to get it twice, just for increased performance there. But again, just to reiterate, we're going to get the attribute value of data-switch, or however our attribute is configured, which is going to give us, in the case, it's going to give us spin or jiggle or whatever. And then we're going to toggle that class just like we did before, but we're also going to say, fire the on-switch event, pass the button that was clicked, and pass whether that button contains the switch class that was toggling on and off. So it'll be true when it's active or that it has that class, and it's going to be false whenever it doesn't. And what's cool about that is now in our app.js, I can accept those parameters into this method. Button is switched like so. And then maybe I'll just, for now, we'll console.log these is switched. And so let's save that, and now let's test this out. It's only going to work on the burrito button here. So let's click on that. That did not work. Oh, I didn't save switch. That's why it didn't work. You do have to save to get that to work. So I saw that little white dot up here. That's why it didn't show up. But here we go. We're good. So it says switching. It's saying here is the button you actually clicked on, and is switched is currently true, meaning it's on. And when I click on it again, it's going to do the same thing, but it's going to log false because we now turned that off. And you can do some cool stuff with this. Like for example, in this case, maybe I want it to be a burrito when it's jiggling and be something else when it's not. I don't know. I'm just trying to make stuff up so we can have examples of how you would do this. But just as an example, you might say button.querySelector.spinner, because the button has a spinner inside of it. And then we can set its text content equal to, and then if is switched is truthy, then we'll set it to, how about a face? So it's going to do kind of the grimacing face whenever it's jiggling back and forth. And then otherwise, we'll set it back to a burrito. I'm just totally making these up off the cuff, but you can just kind of see when it's shaking. And then when you click it again, it goes back to burrito. So that's kind of a weird example, but this is a weird, silly app. So that's totally okay in this case. But I'm just kind of showing you how you can utilize that to do all sorts of interesting things. And this is the very simple method that you would use to create these lifecycle events or these action events, if you will, on your instances of these classes. And again, all you have to do is just specify a lifecycle event with some default stuff that does nothing by default inside of your configuration. And then that allows developers to override that in their own instances of this class. And then you very simply just fire off the event by calling config.whatever you called it, using the parentheses, and then passing any custom data you may want to pass to that. You could do this for the initialize method as well. That's usually a good idea. A lot of times whenever you utilize libraries like Bootstrap and other front-end libraries that contain JavaScript components like this, they often have the ability to do things with lifecycle events like on initialize or on destroy or on toggle or on switch or whatever. And so this is a very common pattern that a lot of people, I think, would expect from a really good front-end JavaScript library that has this component functionality. And it's definitely something we're going to be using and implementing into our web components. And as you can see here, it's not a big challenge to do so. You just kind of have to think about, from your perspective, what sort of lifecycle events would make sense for developers to actually get access to, and what data do you need to pass to those methods. And before we wrap it up, just a quick note about this object.assign thing that is up here. By default, I believe that the Babel.js thing is going to compile that down. Let's actually see. Oh, it doesn't. And that's yet another one of those things. It kind of has some newer support. So if you go to can I use and then do object.assign, you'll notice the support's about 96%, but only 89% without quirks, without known issues. So it's another one of those like questionable issues that you may want to do a little bit of research on your target browsers to figure out if you want to do that. There is, once again, a Babel configuration you can drop in that will transpile this to a different method, or it'll do like a polyfill. Essentially. So just keep that in mind. Object.assign is a little bit newer. And in fact, what I would probably use in most production ready web applications is there's a really great library that you may have used before called Lodash. And it has a lot of object methods that do exactly this, like merging. And especially if your configuration options that you're setting up for your components tend to get more complex. So if you have like parent objects, which then have other values inside of that, and it could get even deeper. When you get to that point, which is common on a web component you may be building, it's probably a good idea to switch to something like Lodash, which I'll show you here. It's just lodash.com, and they have all sorts of libraries in their documentation. There's a merge function, and literally it does the exact same thing as object.assign, but it is going to work a little bit better cross browser. So, and this does some things. There's a clone deep and just all kinds of other things that you can do with objects that maybe you can't do with object.assign and the other ES6 sort of features for objects that are available. So just be aware of that, and feel free to drop in Lodash and use that instead to do this sort of object merging functionality on your options. And especially if your options get more complex, you want to look at using that. And I think that is actually going to do it for our taco spinner. This was a pretty crazy first example that we did. It got a little bit weird there for a while, but I think it was fun to kind of make these things animate and make this silly app that kind of demonstrates all this stuff I wanted to introduce you to for this very simple toggle or switch interaction that we've developed. In upcoming lessons, what we're going to do is we're going to start to develop new interactions and new components using these same patterns that we've developed for our switch. You will find that most of the time when you're developing a web interaction, it's actually quite a bit more complex than working with a single HTML element. In the case of a switch, it's good to start with because there's only a single HTML element, just the button in this case, and then everything occurs in the context of that button, which is going to be pretty easy to work with. But certainly for other sort of patterns and other components that you would typically want to build for any modern web application, that is not always the case. So we're going to start with a new starter solution in the next lesson. We're going to kick it up a notch and start to build out some really cool components using the same method and technique that we've done throughout these starter lessons.